At the beginning of World War II, the United States was not prepared for a large-scale land war. Despite the country's economic power, the U.S. Army in 1939 ranked only 19th in the world in terms of manpower and equipment, right after Romania. America's armored forces existed more on paper than in reality. They had no strategy, no experience, and no clear understanding of the role of armored warfare in the coming conflict. Europe was already in flames. Germany, having violated the Treaty of Versailles and secretly built up its tank forces since the early 1930s, created a completely new concept of warfare blitzkrieg, lightning-fast offensives based on close coordination between aviation, tanks, and motorized infantry. France collapsed in 6 weeks. The British Army retreated from Dunkirk, abandoning most of its equipment. The world understood. The tank had become the decisive weapon of war. America did not. In the United States, there was still debate over whether tanks were even necessary in modern warfare. Some military leaders believed tanks were only meant to support infantry. Others insisted they should fight enemy armor head-on. Still others argued that the future belonged to anti-tank artillery, not tanks. As a result, no unified doctrine was adopted. The U.S. Army was heading toward war divided from within and without a strategy. However, by 1940 it became clear that the United States would not be able to remain on the sidelines. Germany was conquering Europe, Japan was seeking dominance in Asia, and even isolationist America realized war was inevitable. The country urgently needed a tank, one that could be produced in massive numbers, that would be reliable, and that industry could build quickly. That was the beginning of the development of what would later be known as the M4 Sherman. The Sherman was not born from bold engineering ambition, but from compromise. It was not designed to be the best tank of the war. It was designed to be a tank that could be built by the thousands. The United States had no intention of competing with Germany in armor thickness or gunpowder. Instead, America chose to compete in something else: industrial output, numbers, and logistics. But at the time, few people understood this. Many American generals still doubted that tanks had any real value in warfare. And that is why the creation of the Sherman was entrusted not to theorists or military strategists, but to practical engineers, people who knew how to build machines rather than chase perfection. The foundation of the future Sherman was the previous tank, the M3 Lee, an interim design with a highly questionable layout. Its main gun was mounted in a side sponson rather than in a rotating turret, making the tank awkward and vulnerable. Yet it still played an important role. It gave the United States its first experience in crash-producing armored vehicles. And the Sherman became the evolution of that idea, a more advanced design built on the same principle. It did not need to be perfect, it just needed to be present in the war in large numbers. When the Sherman first appeared in trials in 1941, German officers learned about it through intelligence reports. Their initial reactions were dismissive. Its armor was considered weak, its gun mediocre, and its silhouette far too tall. Wehrmacht generals were confident this tank would never survive against modern German armor. They mocked it, convinced it was a product of a nation that did not understand war. Their laughter was premature. Wars are rarely won by the weapon that appears strongest on paper. They are won by combinations of capabilities the enemy does not expect. The Sherman would become exactly such a weapon, built not to win duels but to win a war. But before that became clear, it had to endure humiliation. Its first battles would expose all the weaknesses German generals had noticed, and prove them painfully real. The first Shermans entered service in late 1942. They were supplied not only to American units, but also to the British Army in North Africa under the Lend-Lease program. It was there that the tank faced German armor in real combat for the first time. The North African campaign became the Sherman's trial by fire. In the early stages, it performed better than many expected. Against the Panzer III and the early variants of the Panzer IV, it held its own. Its 75mm gun was capable of penetrating enemy armor at medium range. Its mobility was noticeably better than that of many German tanks. The Sherman proved reliable, easy to operate, and simple to repair, qualities that were extremely important in the harsh desert environment. But it was also there that its biggest weakness was revealed: thin armor. Its frontal hull and turret plates were often penetrated by German anti-tank guns. The Sherman was known to catch fire after a hit, quickly earning a brutal nickname among soldiers, Ronson, after the American lighter brand with the slogan "Lights every time." The internal storage of ammunition along the hull sides made it dangerously vulnerable. A single hit often led to ammunition detonation. For many Allied tank crews, this was a grim introduction to the Sherman. It was a working tool, but it did not inspire confidence. Its main strengths, mass production and mechanical reliability, were not yet visible. On the battlefield, one thing was obvious: it burned. Meanwhile, German engineers continued developing their tanks. In 1943, the Panther and Tiger appeared, armored vehicles of a new level. The Panther combined sloped frontal armor with a long-barreled 75mm KWK-42 gun that surpassed all American equivalents in penetration power. The Tiger had nearly impenetrable armor and a deadly 88mm main gun. These tanks became symbols of German technological superiority. It was at this moment that the laughter of German generals at the Sherman turned into confidence. They did not see it as an opponent, only as a mass-produced target, a crude design built by a nation lacking military culture. In Wehrmacht headquarters, they were certain the Sherman could not compete with German tanks. Even American troops themselves began to complain about its lack of firepower. But those who viewed the war beyond tank duels understood something else. Germany was becoming trapped by its own obsession with building technologically perfect, but overly complex and expensive machines. The Panther and the Tiger were masterpieces of engineering, but they were heavy, maintenance-intensive, slow to produce, and consumed enormous resources. Germany bet on quality. America bet on capability. The Sherman was never designed as a tank for armored supremacy. It was built as part of a larger doctrine, a doctrine of resource warfare and rapid deployment. It was not meant to dominate duels, but to support offensives, protect infantry, secure ground, and hold it. It was made as a tool for an army fighting a long, large-scale war. But that would take time to understand. It would take many defeats, many complaints, and many burning tanks before it became clear. The weakness of the Sherman did not lie in its design. It lay in the way it was being used. The war was only beginning. Ahead lay Normandy, the Ardennes, and the Rhine campaign. Ahead lay thousands of tank battles. Ahead lay the moment that would change the Sherman's reputation forever. Before it became a symbol of Allied victory, it became a symbol of doubt. Early in the war, generals didn't laugh at it. They simply didn't understand it. But they would soon discover that inside this tank was the core of America's entire tactical solution. When the Sherman entered its first major operations, its primary role became supporting the Army's maneuver. It did what the German Panthers and Tigers could not. It moved. It was capable of covering long distances without breaking down, could sustain offensives for weeks, could be transported to any part of the world, by landing ships, by rail, over bridges, across improvised river crossings. Where German heavy tanks bogged down or broke apart, the Sherman kept going. But that became clear only later. At the start of the war, everyone saw only its obvious weaknesses, and those weaknesses could have cost America the war. Military reports were full of criticism. Tank crews complained about insufficient protection. Infantry demanded better support. Engineers argued over upgrades. Politicians questioned whether mass production should continue for a tank that often lost in one-on-one combat. Yet at that very moment, the United States made one of the most important decisions of the war, not to halt Sherman production, but to accelerate it. It seemed illogical. But America understood something Germany had yet to realize. Wars are not won by those who have the best tanks. Wars are won by those who have a strategy. The Sherman was not meant to be the final answer, but the starting point. It became a platform that could be improved. It became the symbol of an army that learned from defeat and adapted during war. It was criticized, mocked, and dismissed as mediocre. But soon the world would see that the Sherman was not America's weakness. It was the foundation of its coming victory. This was not yet clear in 1942. But one thing was, the war had only begun. The Sherman entered it as a tank that was not expected, not respected, and not feared. But it is precisely such machines that change the course of history, not with showy power, but with systematic inevitability. From this point begins the real story of a tank that wasn't the best, but became decisive. A story of a war won not by legends, but by machines built to work. a story of how the Sherman became a force that could no longer be ignored. Ahead of it lay the most brutal phase of the war, where the laughter of German generals would turn into concern. Because ahead lay Normandy. Chapter 2, The First Defeats and the Crisis of Confidence. When the Sherman first entered the front lines, its reputation was insignificant. It came into the war too early and too unprepared. It was used incorrectly, treated as a universal combat vehicle, which it was not. Where a coordinated maneuver with proper cover was required, it was sent into frontal battles against German armor. Where infantry support and artillery coordination were necessary, it was thrown into isolated tank assaults. As a result, the first frontline report sounded like a verdict. The Sherman was considered a weak tank, unfit for combat against the battle-hardened German army. The first serious engagements took place in North Africa in 1942. The Sherman became the main armored force of the British Eighth Army and faced the Panzer III and Panzer IV for the first time. In these battles, its strengths and weaknesses were revealed simultaneously. At medium distances, the Sherman was capable of destroying German tanks and was theoretically equal in mobility. But as soon as the Germans brought anti-tank guns into play, especially the Pak-40, the Sherman began to suffer heavy losses. Its armor was penetrated easily, and its internal ammunition racks caused frequent fires after hits. This became a serious psychological problem among the crews. A harsh nickname spread quickly, the lighter, and not without reason. A hit on a Sherman very often resulted in flames. The situation worsened when the Sherman was forced into a role it was never designed for. It began to be used as an anti-tank weapon, pushed into duels against German armor positioned in superior defensive lines. In such conditions, it lost. German tanks, supported by artillery and well-executed ambush tactics, inflicted severe casualties. In Normandy, the losses suffered by Shermans only intensified the negative attitude toward the tank. Crews said they were being sent to fight in coffins on tracks. And in the British Army a bitter joke spread, the Sherman is the only tank you can die in twice, first by fire, then by ammo explosion. The Sherman's inability to fight German tanks head-on was becoming obvious. When the Panther and Tiger appeared at the front, the situation became critical. The Panther had sloped frontal armor and a high-velocity 75mm gun capable of destroying the Sherman from long range. The Tiger had nearly impenetrable armor and an 88mm gun that could destroy a Sherman before it could even approach effective firing range. The difference in firepower seemed overwhelming. The Sherman had to move closer to penetrate a German tank, and the closer it moved, the more vulnerable it became. Another issue added to the criticism: tactics. In 1942 to 1943, American armored divisions did not yet know how to conduct large-scale mechanized operations against an experienced opponent. Skilled German commanders exploited terrain, took strong defensive positions, organized ambushes, and maneuvered effectively. The Sherman often entered battle on ground already controlled by the enemy. This was not the fault of the machine, it was the fault of its misuse. At that time, the U.S. Army stood on the brink of a major decision: stop Sherman production and develop a new heavy tank, or find a new approach to using armored forces. Many demanded radical changes. Proposals were made to replace the Sherman with a much heavier vehicle, with thicker armor and a more powerful gun, to create an equal match for the Tiger and Panther. But such a move would have destroyed America's greatest advantage: mass production. Criticism of the Sherman became a political problem. Newspapers wrote about heavy losses, tank crews complained about unfair combat conditions, and some officers called for the Sherman to be scrapped as a failure. But at that moment, the United States made a decision that would have an enormous impact on the future course of the war. They did not abandon the Sherman. They decided to learn how to win with it. That moment became a turning point. Army leadership reached a conclusion. The problem was not only the tank, the problem was tactics. The Sherman was not supposed to fight the Tiger one-on-one. It had to operate as part of a larger system. It was not a tank hunter. It was one element in a machine where aviation, artillery, reconnaissance, and logistics worked together. It was not the most popular decision, but it was the decision that saved the Sherman from being discarded. Its story could have ended in 1943, as the story of a failed combat vehicle. But instead, the Sherman survived a crisis of confidence and became the foundation of a new American strategy. A strategy that was not obvious to German generals, but one that would soon turn their laughter into concern. Because wars are not won by the side with the strongest tank. They are won by the side with the strongest system. After the first losses and criticism of the Sherman, many expected the United States to begin developing a new, heavier, better armored tank. But America made a different choice. Instead of trying to match Germany in the power of individual machines, it decided to turn production itself into a weapon. Germany built tanks in factories. America built a war machine that did not produce tanks, it produced superiority. The Sherman became part of a system that changed the very meaning of military capability. The United States understood. A heavy tank with thick armor and a massive gun could be formidable. But what good is such a machine if it cannot be produced quickly and delivered to the front in time? Germany learned this lesson through bitter experience. The Tiger and Panther were indeed dangerous opponents. But producing a single Tiger required around 300,000 labor hours and consumed scarce materials in specialized factories. A Sherman could be built in just 10 to 12 days. What took Germany a month, America could do in a week. By early 1943, U.S. industry was working at full capacity. In factories operated by Chrysler, Ford, General Motors, Fisher Body, and others, Shermans were being assembled daily. More than two-thirds of the tank's components were interchangeable, and its design allowed many of its parts to be produced in civilian factories if needed. This was a key advantage. The Sherman did not depend on a single supplier or a single workshop. Any part could be replaced. Any component could be manufactured elsewhere. This dramatically reduced repair time and made the tank incredibly resilient in the conditions of a long war. It was not the best tank in a duel, but it was the best tank for an army. It was easy to maintain, could be transported by sea or rail, did not require complex repairs, and could be upgraded even in frontline workshops. Its engine and transmission were built for long-distance marches, and its fuel system was designed to operate in different climates. The Sherman reflected exactly how the U.S. Army saw the war: mobile, large-scale, controlled. Where Germany could reinforce the front with 50 new tanks, the United States could send 500. Where Germany lost a machine that could not be replaced for weeks, American units received new Shermans within 48 hours. German armored divisions wore down, their strikes lost force. But the Sherman kept coming because behind every destroyed tank, another one followed. German officers first laughed at the Sherman's numerical advantage. It seemed impossible to take a fortress by numbers alone. But in war, quantity becomes quality when it is backed by a system. The Sherman was not a tactical weapon, it was a strategic one. It did not dominate by armor or gunfire, it dominated by presence. With the Sherman came the growth of U.S. logistics. While Germany lost vehicles due to lack of fuel and spare parts, America built a global supply network. The Sherman never arrived at the front alone. With it came spare parts, fuel, ammunition, repair crews, and recovery vehicles. The U.S. Army learned how to wage mechanized war, a war where every element supported the others. This was a war of replacement speed, where losses were not critical as long as they could be replenished faster than the enemy could inflict them. These factors remained invisible in the early stages of the war, but they were the ones that began to turn the tide of battle. Germany could win duels, but it could not win the war of mechanics and supply. American industry had become a weapon that no shell could destroy. Even when the Sherman suffered defeat, the front stayed alive, and the offensive continued. While German generals mocked the Sherman as a weak tank, they failed to notice something far more dangerous. It was not a weapon by itself, but a piece of something much greater. And that system was only gaining strength. Ahead was its true test, Normandy, the evolution of a tank that didn't break. The Sherman began the war as a tank few believed in. It was heavily criticized by commanders, questioned by the press, and doubted by the very men who had to fight in it. But the key feature of the Sherman was not what it was at the beginning of the war, but what it could become. It was not a finished machine, it was a platform with the potential for development. And that is exactly what allowed it to evolve from a weak participant in the war into one of its decisive instruments. When it became clear that the German Panther and Tiger outmatched the Sherman in range, firepower, and armor protection, the United States did not abandon the tank. It began systematically improving it. The first task was to increase its firepower. Originally, the Sherman was equipped with a 75mm gun that was effective against infantry and fortifications, but had poor armor penetration. Against the Panzer III and early Panzer IV it was still adequate, but against the Panther and Tiger it was no longer enough. In 1943, Shermans armed with the new long-barreled 76mm gun began to appear on the front. Its improved ballistics allowed engagements at greater distances. It did not make the Sherman equal to the Tiger, but it reduced the gap. It gave the tank a fighting chance. However, the real breakthrough came from the British. The British Army used the Sherman as extensively as the Americans, and British engineers sought a way to turn it into a true tank killer. Their solution was to mount the powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun on the Sherman chassis. This version became known as the Sherman Firefly, and it quickly became one of the most dangerous Allied tanks on the battlefield. The Firefly could penetrate the armor of a Tiger at ranges where a 75mm Sherman had no chance. Despite cramped turret space and difficult loading conditions, the Firefly became a vital part of Allied armored units. It pushed the Sherman into a new league of firepower. Beyond armament, another issue had to be solved, the problem that had already cost thousands of crewmen their lives: the Sherman's tendency to catch fire when hit. This was one of the main reasons for its bad reputation. Early versions did indeed burn, often due to poor ammunition storage in the hull sides. But engineers found a solution: the so-called wet stowage system. Ammunition was now stored in compartments surrounded by a fluid container, drastically reducing the chance of fire. After this upgrade, the Sherman's fire rate statistics dropped nearly threefold. Crews noticed the difference, and their trust in the machine began to grow. The Sherman stopped being a lighter and became survivable. The Sherman evolved not only technically, but tactically. It was no longer used as a dueling tank. Instead, it began operating as part of combined mechanized formations, working together with self-propelled artillery, reconnaissance units, and air support. The Sherman became a component of a strike system, not a lone fighter. It coordinated with infantry and assault troops, providing supporting fire and enabling breakthroughs. Its speed and reliability allowed a shift to maneuver warfare, a type of warfare Germany could no longer sustain due to its declining resources and loss of initiative. Another advantage of the Sherman was its versatility. It was not just a tank, it was a platform for dozens of specialized combat vehicles. Engineering Shermans with bulldozer blades, mine-clearing variants, flamethrower versions, bridge layers, amphibious assault support tanks, all were built on the Sherman chassis. On the battlefield, this gave the Allies a crucial advantage. The Sherman could be adapted for any mission. It was not a narrow-purpose machine, it was a flexible asset. This evolution did not happen on a drawing board, it happened in combat. The Sherman changed during the war itself. New versions were not theory, they were a response to frontline needs. Sherman tanks in 1944 were far more effective than those of 1942. And this was not an accident. It was the result of a military system that learned faster than the enemy could adapt. The Sherman was no longer a tank feared by its own crews. It began delivering victories not through spectacle but through consistency. Could not always be called impressive, but it could be called essential. Wars are rarely won by heroic machines. They are won by machines that work every single day. But the Sherman's true role would be revealed later, in the most critical moment of the war, in the largest amphibious invasion in human history. It was there that the Sherman stopped being a machine that needed defending, and became a machine soldiers depended on. Ahead was Normandy, and there, the evolution of the Sherman would be tested by fire. The true test for the Sherman began on June 6, 1944, when the Allies landed in Normandy. It was the largest amphibious invasion in history, and the Sherman formed the backbone of the armored forces involved in the operation. Here, the question was not only about the tank's combat value, but about its purpose in the war. And in the very first days in Normandy, the Sherman encountered its most dangerous enemy, not just German armor, but the terrain itself. Normandy was not the open desert of North Africa, nor the wide plains of the Eastern Front. It was a region of bocage, dense hedgerows, narrow roads, concealed hollows, and fields divided by thick earthen embankments and vegetation. These natural barriers turned every stretch of terrain into a fortified position. The Germans knew this, and they were ready. They occupied commanding ground, hid anti-tank guns with skillful camouflage, covered their armor with minefields and obstacles, and used Panther and Tiger tanks from concealed firing positions to destroy Shermans while remaining unseen. Losses in the first weeks after the landing were immense. This phase of the war produced some of the darkest testimonies from tank crews. They said they could not see the enemy until they were already hit. Panthers and Tigers engaged Shermans from long distances. Pak-40 anti-tank guns hid behind hedgerows and destroyed tank after tank. The Germans used the terrain with brutal precision, and the Sherman lost its greatest advantage, mobility. The advance slowed, and one truth became clear. A Sherman could not defeat a Tiger in a duel, and no one tried to deny it anymore. Yet Normandy became the turning point in understanding how the Sherman was supposed to fight. American commanders abandoned the tactic of direct confrontation and reorganized their approach to battle. The Sherman was no longer a lone combat vehicle. It became part of a coordinated system. Tanks now operated in cooperation with reconnaissance, infantry, artillery, and air support. Coordination, not individual strength, changed the course of battle. The Sherman's greatest advantage became its ability to work with air power. Nearly every tank officer could directly call in air support through radio communication. For the first time, an advancing army facing enemy heavy armor could instantly move the fight into the sky. A phrase began to circulate among Sherman crews. If you can't kill it, call the Thunderbolt. The P-47 Thunderbolt became the armored fist of the tank divisions. With 500-pound bombs and rockets, it destroyed fortifications, artillery positions, and even heavy tanks, if they were spotted and couldn't relocate in time. The Sherman did not defeat German tanks one-on-one. It defeated them as part of a combined system. Alongside air power, the Sherman began working closely with infantry. In Normandy, infantry units suffered heavy losses from hidden firing positions and ambushes. The Sherman was then used as a mobile firing platform, advancing with infantry and suppressing enemy defenses. In response, the Germans began hunting Shermans with Panzerfaust and Panzerschreck anti-tank weapons. This forced the Americans to introduce mutual support tactics. Infantry protected tanks from close attacks, while tanks protected infantry from fortified positions. This cooperation reduced losses and restored momentum to the offensive. The next great test came in the winter of 1944 during the Battle of the Bulge in the Ardennes, Germany's last major offensive on the Western Front, an attempt to split the Allied armies and drive them back to the coast. Here, the Sherman faced not only German armor, but brutal winter conditions. The Ardennes campaign became a battle of endurance as much as firepower. The Panther and Tiger once again showed deadly strength in ambush positions. But their lack of mobility, mechanical reliability problems, and massive fuel consumption made them prisoners of their own design. The Sherman, free from over-engineering, proved more adaptable. It could march over snowy roads, keep supply lines moving, be repaired quickly, and return to battle again and again. By the time of the Ardennes, it became clear the strategy of saturating the front with Shermans and supporting them systematically worked. German armored formations were deadly but rare. The Sherman did not try to destroy them in tank duels. It broke the front through numbers, recovery speed, and teamwork. The Germans won individual battles. The Sherman won the war. In Normandy and the Ardennes, the Sherman ceased to be just a tank. It became a part of a machine that could not be stopped by isolated victories. Its power was not seen in a single battle. It was seen on the map of Europe, shifting steadily eastward, mile by mile. This was not the triumph of a design. It was the triumph of a system. But one question still remained. If the Sherman was not the best tank, why did Germany lose the armored war? By 1944, it had become clear that Germany was no longer fighting for victory. It was fighting for time. Its army was still a dangerous opponent, its tanks were still technically superior to American designs, and the experience of German crews often surpassed that of the Allies. But armored warfare is not a competition of individual machines. It is a competition of systems. And this was exactly where Germany lost to the Sherman. Germany's main mistake was its obsession with perfection over efficiency. The Panther and Tiger were created as a response to the Soviet T-34 and the American Sherman. German industry focused on technological superiority, thicker armor, powerful guns, and long-range firepower. But those advantages came at a cost. The production of the Panther and Tiger was slow, repairs were complex, and reliability suffered due to over-engineering. These heavy tanks often broke down on the march, became stuck on narrow roads, and lost mobility without ever taking a single enemy hit. Germany did not lose because of its tanks, but because they were incompatible with its industrial capabilities. The Panther and Tiger required rare materials, skilled labor, and time, resources Germany no longer possessed. Supply lines collapsed under Allied airstrikes. Factories lost capacity to bombing raids. Every tank lost became a problem that could not be solved quickly. The Sherman was different. It was not a bold engineering experiment. It was a calculated decision. It was built simultaneously in dozens of factories, could be repaired with minimal effort. Its parts were interchangeable. Its production was stable. Germany built tanks for the battlefield. America built tanks for the war. These are two entirely different philosophies. Germany's second major failure was logistics. The German army constantly suffered from fuel shortages. It could not maneuver as it had in the early years of the war. Tanks were abandoned not because they were destroyed, but because their fuel tanks were empty. The Panther, with its powerful Maybach engine, consumed so much fuel that its combat endurance was limited. The Tiger became a symbol of power that could not move. The Sherman, on the other hand, consumed less fuel, and more importantly, it had a guaranteed supply thanks to Allied control of the seas and oil resources. The third reason for Germany's failure was tactical. German armored forces became a defensive weapon. Panthers and Tigers were increasingly used in ambush tactics from pre-prepared positions. They were deadly in defense, but they lost effectiveness in offensive operations. Germany fought reactively, responding to Allied advances rather than taking the initiative. The Sherman, by contrast, became the tank of the offensive. It did not need to win every duel. It simply had to keep advancing. The fourth reason was the loss of air superiority. Allied aircraft crippled German transportation. Rail centers, bridges, and factories were destroyed from the air, breaking Germany's defense from within. On the battlefield, Sherman crews could call in airstrikes directly, turning German heavy tanks into stationary targets. Germany could no longer rely on the superiority of individual machines, because the Sherman did not fight alone. It fought as part of a network. The fifth and final reason was that Germany bet on an elite force rather than a sustainable army. German tank crews were among the best in the world, but they could not be everywhere. Their experience could not compensate for the sheer numbers the Sherman brought to battle. Every Tiger lost meant not only the loss of an expensive machine, but also the loss of an irreplaceable crew. The United States, however, built a training system where a new crew could take a new Sherman and return to battle quickly. The Sherman did not defeat the Panther and Tiger on paper. It defeated them in the reality of war. Its strength was not visible in a single battle. It was visible in the fact that after every battle it came back. It survived Stalingrad, Tunisia, Normandy, and the Ardennes not through superiority but through endurance. It became the symbol of a war won not by legends, but by persistence. That is why Germany lost the tank war. It built weapons to win battles. The United States built weapons to win the war. By the end of the war, the Sherman had become one of the most recognizable symbols of the Allied advance in Europe. But its reputation remained controversial. To some, it was a mass-produced, primitive tank that won by numbers, not quality. To others, it was a reliable and effective combat vehicle that played a decisive role in defeating Germany. A fair assessment of the Sherman requires separating myth from fact, and viewing it not as a standalone machine, but as part of a strategy that shaped the outcome of the war. The first myth, the Sherman was a weak tank. This is false. It was designed as a medium tank for offensive support, not as a dueling machine. Its doctrine did not involve direct engagements with heavy tanks. Its use was based on cooperation with infantry, artillery, and air power. The flaw was not in the Sherman's design. It was in how it was misused early in the war. Once tactics were corrected and later upgrades were implemented, its combat performance stabilized and matched the purpose it was built for. The second myth, the Sherman caught fire more often than other tanks. This claim is based on data from 1942 to 1943 and ignores later improvements. Early Shermans did have a high fire rate due to poorly positioned ammunition racks. But after the introduction of wet stowage, a new storage method that reduced ammunition explosions, the number of fires dropped dramatically. The Sherman no longer stood out negatively. In fact, its crew survival rate became one of the highest among World War II tanks. The third myth: the Sherman won only through numbers. This is an oversimplification. Numerical superiority was a factor, but not the only one. The Sherman was part of a system where production, repair, logistics, and combat doctrine formed a single mechanism. The United States created a tank force capable of sustained offensive warfare. German tanks could win individual duels, but they could not stop a system built on constant reinforcement and industrial momentum. The Sherman was not a weapon of brilliant victories. It was a weapon of inevitable pressure. The fourth myth: the Panther and Tiger were better than the Sherman. This is true only in narrow technical terms. In real battlefield conditions, the Panther and Tiger were too complex, too maintenance-heavy, and too expensive. Their effectiveness was limited by their small numbers, lack of spare parts, and weak logistical support. The Sherman lost in one-on-one combat, but excelled in strategic value. It was easier to produce, easier to maintain, more reliable, and more suitable for prolonged warfare. The Sherman was not a perfect tank. It was not the best tank of the war, but it was never meant to be. It was America's answer to the reality of modern war. A war of resources, supply lines, speed, and coordination. It was part of a system where success came not from isolated superiority, but from continuous operational strength. Its role was not domination. Its role was sustainability. The Sherman's greatest strength was that it always fulfilled the purpose it was built for. It enabled armies to advance. It ensured constant frontline presence. It was a machine that could be shipped anywhere in the world, deployed quickly, and supported by the full weight of American industry. It was not a showpiece weapon, it was a working weapon. It did not seek superiority. It delivered results. The legacy of the Sherman is that it became the first tank designed and used as part of an industrial warfare doctrine. It proved that wars are not won by mechanical brilliance, but by organized endurance. The Sherman was a weapon built not for glory, but for victory. And in that sense, it became one of the most successful combat vehicles of its time.